Begin at the beginning is the phrase. I cannot do that. I begin at the end, the conclusion of my life on earth. I present it to you as it happened, and what happened afterward. A note about the text. You have read my writing, Robert. This account may seem unlike it. The reason, I am limited by my transcriber. My thoughts must travel through her mind. I cannot surmount that. All the grains will not pass through the filter. Understand if I appear to oversimplify, especially at first. Both of us are doing the best we can. So I don't have a lot of experience in reading in the romance genre. I've just never been attracted to the themes of love conquering all and this purpose of reading for a titillation of that sort. On the other hand, I've always been attracted to the horror genre or the thriller genre. I've always found the horror story a humbling story. It's a story that tells us that some paths are less traveled for a good reason, and that, the monster is sometimes a creature that really wants to hurt us. It's not just something that's misunderstood. The cosmic horror story reminds us of our nothingness in comparison to some of the greater powers in the universe. Richard Matheson is one of those authors who has penned some of those great horror and thriller stories, some of the best of all time. What horror writer wasn't inspired by the great I Am Legend and the many film adaptations that followed it? I'm constantly still haunted by the menacing truck from his novella Duel. I often think about it when I'm driving on some lone highway in the middle of the desert. But Richard Matheson is one of those guys that couldn't be boxed in. He's one of those authors that maybe you could describe as the serious novelist. He liked to write first and foremost to see how a book would affect him. And then he would think about, the outside audience. At least that's how I understand the serious novelist. And he's one of those guys that like to cross genres. Not only did he write in the science fiction field and the horror field, but he also wrote some westerns. He wrote a non-fiction book about guns in the Western years. And yes, he did write a couple romance novels. Now, they weren't just romance. Somewhere in Time has a mingling of science fiction. It's a time travel romance story. And What Dreams May Come, I guess you could categorize too as a fantasy novel. So I guess you could say I needed the fantasy element of What Dreams May Come as sort of a chaser for the more sickly sweet romantic parts of the book. And hey, I'm a fan of Richard Matheson, and I wanted to read more of his books, and this was another one he had to offer. And of course I had the memory of the Robin Williams movie that came out in the late 90s, and I kind of wanted to compare a little bit to the book to the film, and I remember being enthralled by the movie's visual effects when I watched it as a teenager, and that was fantastic. They had fantastic visual effects. And at the time, I remember the movie left me, it was thought-provoking for me. I remember meditating on the movie afterwards. It resonated. But I also remember feeling kind of tired and I guess a little depressed. I don't know. It was kind of a draining movie at the same time. Just the intense tone that, remains consistent throughout the whole movie. But anyway, let me get to my book review, which lays ahead. So first, I just want to start out by giving you a basic summary of the setup of the novel. So the novel starts out with a prologue where we see this man who is Chris's brother. He gets a knock at the door, and there's a woman who claims to be a psychic, and she gives him a manuscript that she says is that it was dictated to her by his deceased brother Chris, and that Chris wanted him to have this manuscript so he could learn about the things that happened to him in the afterlife. And so basically the rest of the novel is this manuscript, and we're reading it, I guess you could say, alongside Robert. And so the story is, within this manuscript, is that Chris, he gets killed in an auto accident. And the first part of the story is he remains a ghost trapped within his immediate environment after death. And so he's continually trying to communicate with his wife, who he left behind, but she can't notice him because he's a ghost. And she's trying to come to grips with the reality that he's died. And like, for instance, she holds a seance trying to communicate with Chris, but it ultimately fails. And so then she, is convinced that he didn't survive death. He didn't go on to some other realm. And she really struggles with this. And then also there's this mysterious man who keeps trying to tell Chris, you need to move beyond this immediate environment. You need to move beyond with me. And eventually Chris does, and it elevates him into this beautiful glade, this beautiful place called Summerland, which is, I guess, basically heaven. And it resembles a place where he and Anne used to travel when they were alive. And that's a key actual part of how they exist in this world, because it's not a physical existence. It's an existence that's a state of the mind. And basically his mind has created this place based on a good memory from those times when he was with his wife in life. And this mysterious man turns out to be a guy named Albert, who is his cousin. It's the spirit of his cousin. And he becomes sort of his spirit guide in Summerland. And so he teaches them how to exist within this world, how to create things, how to move around within it. And, they play sports there and do all these little recreational things. And it's basically just kind of this easygoing paradise, is the way I saw it. But he does learn some disappointing news. So it turns out that his wife Anne ends up dying, and she killed herself. And due to the laws of the afterlife, this sends Anne into a lower realm, basically a hell-like realm. And Albert's job is to travel to these lower realms, and Chris wants to go with him because he wants to retrieve his wife and convince her to come to Summerland with him to try to bring her back. But, there's the complication of bending the laws of the afterlife, but there's also the concern that Chris could get stuck himself in the lower realms. So Albert's really uneasy about it, but eventually Chris convinces him to let him come, and so that's where you get into the real meat of the story. The real development of the conflict arrives as Chris travels into the lower realms of the afterlife. And of course, it's the love Chris has for his wife that, compels him to travel to the lower realms, to take that risk of the dangers and the violence and the horrors of hell. He's willing to confront all these dangers because he loves his wife as much as he does. So, that's the romantic element of it. That's the part that tugs at our heartstrings, so to speak. So one thing I enjoyed right away when I was reading this novel was Richard Matheson's description of the afterlife, of Summerland and the lower realms. And he just has excellent detail work, and it's constructed in a very convincing way, and it matches the book has kind of a clinical, serious tone, and the way he describes the afterlife fits that clinical, serious tone very well. He also has an introductory note at the beginning of the book that explains that he did a lot of research in preparation for writing the novel, and in the back he has a bibliography of like 100 books, and these books, are religious books. Some of them are books that supposed psychics wrote, defining, their visions of the afterlife. Some of the books detail people's supposed near-death experiences and what they claim to have glimpsed of the afterlife. And Richard Matheson basically, picks details out of these books and uses them as creative fodder to construct this afterlife. And did a very good job with it. For example, I really enjoyed how he depicted the lower realm where Anne exists after she commits suicide. Because, you imagine a suicide victim as someone who's, very despairing and feeling hopeless and lonely. And the world she lives in is this derelict house with, cracks in the walls. The plants are withering away. Spiders are crawling all over the place. And it's a mirroring reflection of the state of her mind, which is how these spirits exist in this afterlife. Their existence is a state of mind. I also really liked it because it plays on a proverb from the Bible. There's that proverb that states, "As a man thinketh in his heart, so he is." And I think the novel plays on that theme very well. So Richard Matheson uses an excellent focusing device technique throughout each chapter of the novel that I absolutely loved. He titles the chapter with a poetic phrase that matches the thematic context of the chapter. And then the last sentence of the chapter ends with that poetic phrase. So for instance, he has a chapter titled Dream of Dreaming, and he ends that chapter with this sentence: "Hold her lovely warmth in my arms and kiss her tenderly and laugh as I told her how bizarre it is to dream of dreaming." Pretty cool, huh? I really like it. It of course serves as an ornamental quality in terms of the cosmetics of the narrative, but it also serves as a pattern, an image pattern, so to speak, that keeps the reader focused throughout the novel. So, what is it that I disliked about the novel? I don't know, I've got mixed feelings about it. I mean, this is a romance novel. This is a story that's about love conquering all. And I gotta give this book credit. While yes, love in a sense does conquer all, it does so with a price. Because you see, Chris in the end, he's given this situation where he's able to return back to Earth, but with a new body, as well as Anne, so they both basically get reincarnated as new people. But they have to find each other again. And they don't have memory of who they were. But the idea sort of is that faith in themselves as being soulmates and faith in their love for one another will bring them back together again. And that, of course, is what tugs on your heartstrings, right? Is you're going, oh, I hope they will again, and I believe they will because they're soulmates and their love can bring them back together again, right? That's kind of the point of the book. And so, but there's a cost to it, because maybe they won't. And that's a little bit, I think, of the horror writer and Richard Matheson showing up, is he's given them that cost, that humbling cost of maybe they won't find each other again. Maybe they'll get lost, or maybe they'll find somebody else. And so I'm able to accept that. It pleases the horror writer part of me. But what I'm about to say will come across as somewhat contradictory, because what I'm about to criticize, I was also praising earlier. I was praising the research he did, and I was praising how well he constructed the afterlife and made it seem so realistic and clinical in a sense. But you know what? That's also kind of what annoys me about the book, too. It has this heavy self-importance to it. All the high and mighty research about the afterlife, blah, blah, blah. Is it a romance story, or is it a dissertation for a religions course? But I must say that is what makes this book great. This book feels original. You can't categorize What Dreams May Come as a run-of-the-mill romance, nor is it a run-of-the-mill fantasy. Richard Matheson wasn't wasting time with such cliches. He wrote something he truly believed in, and you can tell. The book challenges you as well as the genre. That's why I give this book a 4.5 out of 5. The monster is satisfied. Well, that concludes my book review, and thank you for tuning in to DeathGroundReviews, the monster that devours horror, suspense, and all those things of the fantastic. I'll see you soon.